on today's World Inside. As the U.S. is keen on raising tariffs against the rest of the world, straining trade and economies, how can the business community better weather the storm and turn the tide? We get up to speed with observers in Shanghai to decode Chinese enterprises' resilience against headwinds. In today's Survive and Thrive, a special series on how China's businesses are dealing with tariff war uncertainties, turning challenges into opportunities, and looking to a new horizon amid all the changes.
The tariff war, the world's biggest uncertainty, might not bring manufacturing jobs back to America, yet it shakes the lives of hundreds of millions elsewhere in the world. How are Chinese businesses taking the hit? More importantly, how are they finding their way out? I have been traveling to China's business and manufacturing hubs, talking to many shop assistants, robot technicians, leading multi-channel network stars, and global textile gurus, amazed at how they are reinventing themselves out of the crisis into new horizons. Survive and thrive, preparing for a better world.
The US that has backed off on every single tariff threat against China. China has matched the increase and matched the decrease.
I think the strategy from Beijing, and it's a very intelligent strategy, is to be a source of stability.
How do we survive? Or at least in the case that if I cannot sell products to the US market directly, I might as well look at other regions.
The U.S. policy of indiscriminately imposing new tariffs shows no signs of letting up. Recently, President Donald Trump began sending letters to his counterparts all over the world, informing them about unilaterally slapping tariffs on America's trading partners worldwide, starting August 1st. Over the recent months, China and the U.S. held 2 rounds of high-level trade talks in Geneva and London, where a consensus was reached on a bilateral economic consultation mechanism. But the impacts of the U.S. tariffs on China so far have already strained the bilateral business interactions, causing tremendous concern to the entire business world, not to mention consumers in both countries. This comes despite incremental steps to increase interactions, such as that between Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi and U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio.
我用4个词来形容这次对话的话。
I summarize the meeting in the following words: strengthening contact, preventing misjudgment, managing differences, and expanding cooperation.
管控分歧，拓展合作。
To take a closer look at the real-world impact of the tariff war on businesses, I was joined by a panel of scholars and observers from China, the U.S., and Europe. Sitting in a huge warehouse in Shanghai, we began our conversation. Good to see all of you here. Thank you so much. We are in a storage place of an online platform here in China. You can see how the consumption is still very much inspiring. Now, I would like to ask every one of you to use 1 or 2 adjectives to describe how you see China is responding to the U.S. tariffs. Professor Chen?
I guess I will use 2 phrases. One is to wait and see, negotiate with the US, but more importantly, boosting consumption has been the #1 task for the Chinese economy over the last 2 years.
All right. Professor Geraci?
I think the response has been that China has indicated that it can do without the US market more than the US can do without Chinese products. Even if China has a trade surplus, it is products that are not easily substituted with others. Money, China can find other markets.
Adaptation is one word, okay? So this ability to respond to crises. But another word that I would use here that I think is really sort of a sensitive word is pivot. You know, the U.S. was going to pivot in some way against Asia or against China, but what we see is China pivoting and being able to adapt its market to meet these challenges, which, by the way, are not necessarily something that are going to go away. Even if the tariffs go away, the U.S. is still facing problems.
We've been having trips to 3 different entities, as all of you know. One is a 100-year-long textile manufacturer. Second is an e-commerce platform like this, in which new trends of consumption is very inspiring. Third is a robotic AI company in China, one of the unicorns of that locality. So they are so different, Professor Tian, in nature and in their businesses. And yet, when I see how they survive and thrive, it's really kind of inspiring. So overall speaking, what do you think is the most important strategy China should have?
I guess in terms of going forward, I see there are multiple forces of driving continued growth. Obviously, application of AI in all fields is one, increases efficiency. And second, as we are talking about consumption, and as you introduce the stories, I think we are witnessing a great transition in terms of how people consume. Where do they buy their products? If you're a producer, where do you sell them? How do you sell them? That's going on right now. And this process will continue, and this process will determine how successful, how quickly China can adapt to the new environment.
And what the consumers want these days.
As I said, where do you get your products? That's important because there are many Chinese firms, maybe 5 years ago, they target what we call developed markets, Europe and the US. Obviously, there are obstacles now. But as the purchasing power of domestic households go up, they could make as much profit selling to domestic consumers as they go abroad. But again, they need to adjust the process. And two, as I said, it's young people, the way how they purchase goods is very different from before. And that's why we see these digital platforms, influencers, 主播, they're thriving.
Professor Mahoney, do you think stories like these are being well told in the US? Do consumers and policymakers really aware how China is not only surviving, but also thriving as a result of the latest challenge?
But no, the problem with U.S. is that there isn't much information, much reliable information about China. There are, I think, some entrenched biases and misunderstandings that have been, unfortunately, easily manipulated, not only by mainstream media, but also political leaders, as well as American companies that really don't want to compete with China. They want to try to create monopoly conditions in tech fields or other fields. So this is something that's very difficult for Americans to perceive, above all because they still think of themselves as being better than China.
Interesting. What about for Europe? Mr. Geraci, you are coming from Italy. I know Europe is so different one place from another. But how do people there interpret what is going on here in China vis-a-vis the tariffs? And do they know stories like these?
Also in Europe, there is very little knowledge of Chinese development. One is because maybe even the analysts look at the GDP comparison, for which the EU has, let's say, 4 or 5 times higher GDP per capita than China. But like as Professor said, if we look at GDP per capita on PPP adjusted purchasing power parity, then European citizen is only twice as rich as the Chinese average citizen. That means that the potential of Chinese consumption is much bigger than we think. So we do have an underestimate of the potential of the Chinese market, and therefore we tend to believe that China needs us, while instead,
we need
yes, of course,
other.
China needs a little bit of the European market, but not as much as we think. And that's why on this tariff dispute between Trump and China, it has been the US that has backed off on every single tariff threat against China. China has matched the increase and matched the decrease. But it's always been the US to do the first move up and the first move down once they realize that maybe China doesn't need as much as we think. But in Europe, there's a lot of really misinformation also in the mainstream media that does not help companies understand the true potential of the Chinese market. So we do damage to ourselves.
Others' understanding about China is one thing, but how China is dealing with the current crisis is another thing. Professor Tian, so many times people have been telling me throughout our trips this time how they are trying to seek opportunities out of crisis, to deal with problems that have long been there and not necessarily solutions are being crafted. And this time it's different. Is it?
So this is a great question. So over the last 2 months, I had the opportunity to talk to a lot of companies, listed companies. What really impresses me is that these companies are constantly seeking opportunities. In fact, the first time they started to relocate their supply chain and markets was actually in 2018. That's when Trump started the first round of tariff. So this time when I talked to them again, I was very impressed how quick they are in terms of reacting to the changes. Yeah. So when I asked them like how bad it's going to be, right. Like every company, they gave me like 3 scenarios. If this is the case, our profit will be hit. But if this is the case, we'll be fine. That's one. They seem to be very reactive. The second thing is that I think the current environment, they're changing in 2 directions. One is they will continue to be global, but there are going to be more changes because as we know that U.S. is negotiating trade agreements with, for example, Southeast Asian countries. So maybe Chinese companies, they've been in Vietnam for many years, but they need to change their strategy a little bit. And on the other hand, they want to focus more on the Chinese market. Mm-hmm. But again, I think there's a process because just because you're very efficient in setting up your production and sales to the US, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can do very well in China because it's just a very different market. So I think a lot of companies are trying to adapt.
We have some long-standing challenges. For example, how to deal with the potential threats of overcapacity. For example, how to create jobs that's likely to be sustainable. For example, how to encourage local entities to be able to function with the market rules and potential. All of these are questions long-standing. There are temporary answers. Do you see this time people are really determined to find the ultimate answers, even though they're hard?
5.4% GDP growth is not just good, it is very good, even compared to any other market that has a GDP per capita of 12,000 US dollars. Yeah, sure. So it is not, China is a growing economy, so 5% is okay. 5% is very, very good.
Right.
There is no other country with GDP per capita of 12,000, PPP adjusted 25,000 that grows at 5%. So China does very well. The problem is that people have been used to a 10% growth. So the individual perceives a decline in the growth rate, which is true, yeah. But this is the way of life. We should tell our Chinese consumers that the rest of the world, Europe, grows at 0.5.
Because on the one hand, we know that the Chinese companies have been very good at selling products overseas after the accumulation of knowledge. But on the other hand, you can also argue that they should know the Chinese consumers better than foreign firms. It's just that they need to make that switch. They need to tell themselves that going forward, the profit margin of going to Europe is not going to be like before. We have to spend more resources in the Chinese market. And once you make that switch, I think there's going to be a process. But again, I'm very impressed with if you will, the younger generation of Chinese entrepreneurs, whatever the industry is, they can be very quick. I think on the other hand, from the government, from the market design perspective, one issue that's very important is that you see this sort of perhaps bad competition in terms of pricing. Right. You see that in electric vehicles, and you sometimes see these consumer products. I think that's going to be a hurdle.
Is that the key to deal with the potential of the threats from overcapacity?
The way I would define, especially if I'm a market economist, the way you define capacity depends on a lot of things. Depends on the price system, depends on how large the market can potentially be. Right. So I view this as more of there needs to be more adjustment on the pricing system. Because once the pricing system is really transparent and market-based, firms will adjust their behavior.
I agree, Professor. If the government lets a company lose money, it is a choice, maybe to stimulate infant industry to develop, but then, of course, you need to take the hit. The foreign markets may not be as open as you would wish. So if you set a minimum prices for the goods in the international market, maybe you have best of both worlds. You can stimulate the innovation and you close one eye when companies lose money. At the same time, you keep international prices high enough not to be impacted by the reaction and tariffs. Still, I take EV. BYD prices in Europe are higher than BYD prices in China. And still, the European Union put tariffs. So even prices above a certain threshold are not enough, because the philosophy, and I tell you what the European Commission thinks, they don't look at whether there is dumping, they look at whether the BYD cars is cheaper than the BMW. And it will always be. So there is almost no escape
and that is
into
not
that
how things
system,
should be, by
because
the way.
we confuse dumping with the cheap.
How are we going to articulate, for businesses, here in China, for example, the flip-flop trading policies, especially tariff, coming from the current administration? Today is 100%, tomorrow it can be 10, and the next day it could be 50 or come to 200, who knows? So, Professor Mahoney, this flip-flop thing, what does it mean for the United States with others? What does it mean for others without the United States?
Well, I think what we've seen with the U.S. is that they've had an economic downturn because of this chaos. And, this idea that Trump aggresses and then retreats, aggresses and retreats. I think it's created a lot of confusion for U.S. companies. And this will in turn create other economic hardships. But we've already seen in the first quarter a downturn in the economy, and there's fears, real fears, that we'll see a recession if they don't figure out some sort of solution. I think in terms of the rest of the world, one of the terms we hear so often with Europe is strategic autonomy. This is certainly something that I think Korea is thinking about with its new president, certainly something that Japan is concerned about, and certainly something China is concerned about in so much as it has to produce its own chips because of the tech blockade or the chips legislation for the United States. So I think the word de-risking is a word, but it's got to be de-risking without decoupling, and there's got to be some way to salvage the international trading system, realizing that going forward, there will be de-dollarization, and we can't count on the U.S. to be a faithful contributor to the WTO.
Well, this flip-flop thing going on, as some could argue, a tactic of negotiations, how could economies adjust, including that of China's?
For most of the business, I think, one, they're very realistic, and two, they look back at their history, starting in 2018. The strategy I hear from them is that they're all thinking, how do I survive without the US market? That's it. Now, obviously, there are industries and firms that used to rely on the US market more, so their adjustment is going to be more painful. Right. But even these firms says, look, we have to find a way, because it doesn't look like, and you cannot keep too much of a high expectation on how these negotiations will pan out. Or at least in the case that if I cannot sell products to the US market directly, I might as well look at other regions. And in terms of the regions, I think this time what's different from before is that, again, the traditional thinking is that you want to go to the developed markets because of the pricing. You have more profit margins. So Europe, naturally, people look at Europe. But now, you look at Southeast Asia. A lot of these countries are actually doing quite well. Right. Their demand is going up. And then you have the frontier, you have Latin America, you have Africa.
The Middle East.
Middle East, of course. So I think these Chinese companies are looking at all the regions outside the US and think about how they're going to position themselves. And of course, you cannot be a Chinese company without completely ignoring the domestic market.
What about for Europe?
I was in Brussels last week and I met with some officials there. The European Union works against the interest of European companies. I want to be very clear about that. They are ideologically driven. They don't fully understand the economics of trade. They do follow, they try to be seen as following what the US does. And now when the US changes side, the European Union is stuck in the middle. And China, let's not forget, the European Union has put a tariff on EV vehicles for no reason, as I say, just because they're cheap. Has declared the Chinese a systemic rival, which is something that, if it is true, you don't say it. If it is not true, you don't say it. So this is how
sounds like the
it is the worst of foreign policy that can be done.
Professor Mahoney, we understand American businesses sometimes feeling like being caught in between as well. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, they want to compete in the Chinese market, even though the competition is becoming ever more fearful. Mm-hmm. And of course, they're demanding for what they consider as equal treatment. On the other hand, they are also trying to work with Washington to seek an advantage in terms of their potential business environment and potential competitive edge. So how does that work?
I think American companies are in big trouble right now. And they're in big trouble because a lot of Chinese companies, as you said, they have experienced this trauma of, okay, I'm not going to sell in the United States. I'm not going to expose myself to that danger. And this goes back to 2018. So what happens if we come up with a trade deal? Are Chinese companies going to rush back to the American market? No, they're developing the Chinese market. And so then even if you open the Chinese market more to US products, it will be the Chinese companies that have now pivoted and are prepared to sell to Chinese consumers who are, by the way, angry with American made products or American companies because of the trauma and the attempt to humiliate the country. So this is, I think, really sort of a dangerous moment for the future of trade. Even if we come up with a deal, I think a lot of Chinese consumers are ready to buy Chinese products. And again, you were talking about there's not an appreciation of the power of the Chinese economy. The figure that I like to come back to is the fact that you have 400 million middle-income earners in China. In other words, you have a middle-income population larger than the entire U.S. population. So when you think about aggregates or purchasing power, you really have to think in terms of that massive population, which is bigger than the entire U.S. population. That's a market that you're going to be finding yourself in an eroding position. I think American companies are very, very, some of course are in bed with Trump. Some want to take advantage of protectionism. Others are really, I think, terrified to challenge him in the public sphere. And so we see, I think, companies like Apple and others that have very good economic relationships with China through the years. Even Tesla, which had a very good relationship. But they've struggled to have some sort of clear input in China, in Washington, in ways that protect their market share in China.
How much policymakers they should count into the creativity and agility of business world is really a big question mark, whether they understand it. Just look at in this storage place. There are products coming from all over China, all over the world. And they will be, many of them, in one live studio. Every day, a few thousand products. And Chinese consumers are enthusiastically buying. But with a lot of thinking these days, ever more sophisticated. We have to see, how is Chinese consumer looking at their consumption habits and why they want to consume certain things and why they do not like others. With policies like these, with ill feelings as a result of geopolitics, how will businesses be able to lure consumers from quote unquote the other side considered by the policymakers and the politicians?
I guess this can come from two sides. So you're absolutely right. Every time I talk to these entrepreneurs, I'm very impressed on how quick they can adapt. I think from their perspective, because China always wants to create a better business environment for companies, especially private-owned companies, non-SOEs, if you will. But if you look at these,
With recent law,
that's
private sector
it's just implementation. But if you look at how creative these companies are, in fact, they don't need a lot of advantages as long as there are no walls set up for them, as long as it's fair. And fair doesn't have to be you create something special for them, as long as they're on the same ground with other firms, bigger firms. Two, I think on the one hand, if you for Chinese people, I still think they like U.S. products. They still like very much like European products. And if you talk to the Americans who've been here recently, most of the time they'll say that, wow, China doesn't really look like how we perceive in the U.S. and Chinese people are very friendly. So I think,
Professor Mahoney has much more experience about that because many of his friends and relatives are visiting China. Last time you told me about you are already become a liaison office of your family. Who want to come to China and have a look.
So I actually think that people,
the thing is,
people are still, as long as there's communication channel, I think people can look beyond what governments are fighting. They're
going to find
in that sense, I'm more hopeful in terms of, it's important. You don't want to be
grassroots.
Exactly.
My advice also to foreign companies that come to China is that don't just look at whether you will make money or not. I think it is important to be in China because it's the best training camp in the world. You are under fierce competition. You are under fierce continuing changes in regulation, situation, the consumer taste, the evolution of the taste, etc. You need to be here to learn. Even if you don't make money, the learning, you will bring it back to the US, to Europe. But that's why we, foreigners, are here to continuously learn and adapt, because we know our own career is on the line every day. We could be fired. We are professors, maybe less likely, but still possible. Companies can lose market, but if they continue to be here, they go down the learning curve together with their own competitors, with the Chinese local competitors. Right. So my advice is be here, because also it is not just China, it's the rest of the 6 billion people that go along with China, along the Belt and Road, the multipolar world, Southeast Asia and Africa. You cannot just shut off your market and do business within Italy and France and Germany.
Right.
This is not 100 years ago anymore.
One of the things I have learned through this trip and through our talk this time is when we are being pissed off by what is going on in the headlines, let's just go and visit our friends to see what they are doing and how they're trying to come up with both realistic and innovative ideas that implement them to make things happen, great things happen, like here. Thank you so much for the view. Appreciate it.